There are wounds that never bleed. They leave no scars on the skin, yet they shape the entire architecture of a life. Long before psychology had language for emotional absence, before the world understood the fragile necessity of care, the human mind learned to survive by pretending, smiling when it felt empty, obeying when it felt unseen, adapting when it needed holding. This silent adaptation would later become central to what we now know as the Winnicott theory of development, but it did not begin as theory. Let's talk about Donald Winnicott, the psychologist who taught the world how to be real. It began as a quiet observation, a child who looked calm yet felt unreal, a smile that did not belong to the self behind it, a life lived correctly, but not authentically. Donald Winnicott did not set out to explain the human mind. He set out to understand what happens when the self is never allowed to exist. And in doing so, he changed psychology forever. Before Winnicott, the dominant psychological belief was simple and cruel. Children adapt, and adaptation means health. Obedience was maturity. Compliance was stability. Emotional silence was strength. The mind, according to this worldview, was something to discipline, not something to nurture. Yet beneath this certainty, something was deeply wrong. Children were growing into adults who functioned perfectly and felt nothing. Lives were being lived successfully, yet emptily, and psychology had no language for this quiet suffering. Donald Winnicott noticed. Before he became one of the most influential figures in developmental psychology, Winnicott was simply a pediatrician listening, watching, and paying attention to what others ignored. He noticed how infants reacted not to rules, but to presence. He noticed how babies didn't need perfection, but reliability. And he noticed how emotional failure did not always create rebellion. Sometimes it created obedience. Winnicott's own life subtly mirrored his work. Raised in a structured English household, surrounded by order and expectation, he grew into a man deeply attuned to emotional nuance. Not loud, not dramatic, but observant. He became fascinated not with behavior, but with being. The question that haunted him was deceptively simple. What does a child need in order to feel real? Not safe, not successful, but real. From this question emerged what would later become the core of the Winnicott theory of development. Winnicott proposed that development unfolds in stages, but not rigid, mechanical ones. Instead, psychological development depends on the presence of what he famously called the good enough mother. Not a perfect caregiver, not an ideal parent, but one who adapts just enough. In the earliest stage, the infant exists in what Winnicott described as subjective omnipotence. The baby feels as though it creates the world. Needs arise and are met. Hunger appears and milk arrives. The world feels responsive, alive, intimate. This illusion is not a problem. It is necessary, because it is here that the self begins to form. But something crucial must happen next. Gradually, the caregiver begins to fail, not completely, not cruelly, but naturally. The world stops responding instantly. Frustration enters. Reality intrudes. This marks the transition into objective reality. And if handled gently, this frustration does not destroy the self. It strengthens it. But when care fails too early or too completely, the child adapts by splitting. A false self emerges. A version designed to survive, to please, to comply. The true self retreats. This is the most haunting insight of the Winnicott theory of development. Some people are not broken, they are hidden. Winnicott faced resistance for these ideas. Traditional psychoanalysts criticized his softness. His emphasis on environment challenged theories that blamed internal drives alone. His refusal to pathologize adaptation unsettled institutions built on diagnosis. But Winnicott persisted. He spoke not in certainty, but in compassion. He warned that a society obsessed with performance would raise generations of false selves, people who look functional but feel hollow, adults who cannot play, minds that cannot rest. The psychological cost of this work was real. Winnicott remained deeply introspective, often solitary, aware that understanding the mind meant confronting its fragility. Yet his legacy is everywhere, in modern therapy where safety precedes insight, in parenting philosophies that value presence over perfection, in the understanding that mental health is not the absence of symptoms but the presence of authenticity. Today, the Winnicott theory of development continues to whisper a radical truth. You do not become yourself by being correct. You become yourself by being held, then gradually released. And perhaps the most important lesson Winnicott left us is this: the mind does not ask for perfection. It asks for permission to exist. Legends like Winnicott do not shout, they listen. And in listening, they teach the world how to hear itself. This has been Chronicles of Legends.